Given that you have extensive experience with rental properties and owning investment properties in general, and you still keep close in touch with your property managers and people that manage some of those rentals, in general, what should DIY landlords focus on right now, given the current pandemic situation and all of the unknowns that have yet to play out?
Well, I think your answer is kind of built into the question. There are a lot of unknowns right now, so as a landlord, I can only really say what I'm doing with my rentals, and that is there's a lot of unknowns, and so I'm proceeding as normal. I already have policies and procedures in place. Rent was due on April 1st, and we're flowing through that. And any tenant that is having any unexpected issues definitely need to reach out as normal. But on May 1st, rent is due as well. And so, yeah, with the given unknowns, it's business as normal.
Yeah, and it is interesting to note actually that I believe some surveys have come out showing that tenants in general have paid, I believe it's something upwards of 90% of tenants have paid rent on time for the month, which is pretty normal for prior years for the same time frame. So nothing too crazy has played out yet, though that has been kind of the theme in the media that the rent would not be paid. We really just haven't seen that with a bunch of these surveys that have come out from landlords and from companies that process rental payments across the United States. So, but are you familiar with the SBA's Economic Injury Disaster Loan? And is that something that DIY landlords or small property management companies may want to look into in the event that things do go south and one of these upcoming months rent really does actually go unpaid, and instead of 90% paid, it's 70% paid?
I definitely can't say I'm an expert in the topic of the SBA loans. However, I do know that those are the same loans. When I was working with the governor, those are the same loans that were assisted or offered for assistance throughout Texas when they were hit with the hurricanes. I know they've expanded that program. I don't know if property managers fall into that category. I know SBA has also expanded their 7A. The PPP loan is what it's known as, 3Ps. This one has loan forgiveness in it. I know it had a caveat against real estate developers. And so I believe that is expanded to anyone who is a DIY landlord and therefore has any part of their business that's self-employed. And so if they do any of that, they would qualify. Um, and then there's also the tax credit. I forget the name of the program. Um, but I think the two requirements are that you've lost 50% of your revenue month over month, or you have completely shut down, then you are or can ultimately file to get some tax credits. So, but to veer in the sake of what's going on right now and the amount of communication, I think it's better to leave that to those extremely knowledgeable about the topic and not just generally. So if there are any questions about that, please don't refer to me. Go to sba.gov, and there's lots of information that they're putting out every day for that. Or you can find a local SBA lender in your community, which sba.gov site has. And so I would definitely refer to going to those as resources to find out the exacts of who and how and what eligibilities there are.
Yeah, the SBA.gov website has a lot of great material and information, and I believe you can even do some of the actual applications and stuff through that website, but definitely want to check that out. I know personally some small businesses who have filed and received the PPP forgiveness loans or something along those lines. And so I do know that a lot of people have been approved for those. I've also heard that a lot of people have not been approved for them, but it doesn't hurt to apply for it if you meet all of the application requirements But in general, with the current unemployment rate and the economic uncertainty, what are some ways that landlords can work with their tenants that would both help the tenant make a payment when money is tight and still allow for the landlord to have an income and pay their bills?
This is a touchy subject. As a landlord out there waiting to get rent, there's a mortgage. There hasn't been a lot of talk of how to assist landlords, but the general consensus out there is how do we help tenants? And so there's a misconception that these all are landlords. Those are businesses of which have to make their mortgage payments. They have property taxes due. They have utilities due, just like any other business. And so an inability to recoup the rent or to have actions against that rent really is only hurting the small business more than protecting a tenant. And that's because if any of these landlords lose the house, well, the tenant too has lost the house. So to protect just the landlord or to protect just the tenant and see it from just a tenant point of view is a misfortune. I think from a lot of viewpoints. And unfortunately, landlords are always the viewed bad guy. I think in a long-standing history. But it is really important as a landlord to understand what kind of economic environment we're in. Unemployment is 4.4%, but that's only stated, and it's about a month behind. So when they track unemployment, those people who are employed were not part of the survey because that's back in February. And so if you look at just unemployment benefits, then what has been filed, we're looking at over 20 million people over the last month have filed for unemployment benefits. And then if you count in those who operate under a 1099, and so unemployment benefits are just those who pay into it, so you have to be a W-2 employee. So 1099, you're talking about another 10 to 15 million people who are unemployed. And so if you take that into account, that's not 4.4%. That's nearly 13 to 15% of our workforce. And so to have 15% unemployment right now is unprecedented in a 1 month span. And we're now just into April. And so we have not seen, we're still shut down. There hasn't been a lot of changes. And so there are some economic predictions around hitting 30%. We have an oil shock that just went through our country. And so a lot of the oil industry was already stretched thin on financing. And people think, oh, oil only impacts Texas, maybe North Dakota. But think of all the things that are produced out of a lot of these independently owned and operated oil franchises, all the way down to every piece of plastic that's used, lots of production, lots of byproducts in agricultural and fertilizer, and each one of those will be impacted by this, and it'll probably cause a lot of roll-ups. And so there's quite a bit going on in our economy that we definitely should take note. Something has happened, and about 12 years ago, we were facing a time when tenants really had the power in rentals. And what I mean by that is, if you were a property manager or a landlord, you would offer maybe a month free rent to move in, plus a VCR or a DVD player that gives you the time frame. But you'd have incentives to move in, and those have long gone. Now you can demand first month's rent, last month's rent, plus security deposit, and rent prices are going up. And so as demand increase, then it puts power more into the landlord's hand. But if tenants are shifting and looking for new places to live and moving in with each other, divorce rates drop, as happened in 2008 to 2010. A lot of those things reduce demand, and if demand lowers, and that will naturally leave supply going, then rent prices have a good chance of dropping. And as rent prices drop and demand from tenants drop, it means the name of the game won't become how do I increase rent. The name of the game will be how do I maintain full occupancy rates. And so it's really about making sure we find ways that we are working with tenants and hearing what tenants are going through so we can plan for that. Because if the market does change, it means it's going to become more expensive to get a tenant. And so vacancy rates are going to cost us a lot more. So right now, the average vacancy is between $1,200 and $1,600, and that means you have to do a bunch of repairs. You have time that the vacancy was down. You have marketing. You have lots of due diligence time to get the tenant to move in, and all those are costs. And so to really get those costs cut down, it means you need a tenant as fast as possible. And so when this turns, it means if there are incentives you have to do or lower rent, those are just added costs on top of that. So the game is really going to be about how do you keep good tenants and maintain them for a long time over all of your properties. And so finding ways to do that is really important. In talking to tenants, there's lots of ways. I would say right now, going back to the other question, there's a lot of unknowns, so there's no need to do a lot. But the one thing that I've noticed in talking to landlords that is probably something to be avoided is just due to the regulation that has happened in many cities where there's limitations on how you can raise rent. You should probably avoid raising rent for the short time at least, just because you are not wanting to scare off any tenant who might leave. Right now, the name of the game is how do I keep a tenant? How do you maintain low occupancy rates? And so there will be issues where we have to think through, like, what if they can't pay rent? How do I keep a tenant to maybe go through some things? So there's like deferred deposits. There's definitely a deferral plan. I said deferred deposits, I mixed them. But a deferral plan and possibly using part of your deposit. I think something that's going to have to really be thought about are rentals that involve lots of roommates. You may have one roommate who can pay and another one who can't. And so figuring out all those leases in advance and making sure you kind of have a plan of attack on how to address those is important, because if there's roommates involved, you may have a couple of really good tenants and you may have a bad one in there. So you have to figure out how do you manage that. And so there's a lot coming out and a lot to be thought of. But I think the key here is landlords really need to understand that we're going into an unprecedented time in the economy. And it's definitely one where we need to be very keen on making sure we keep our tenants.
I completely agree with that assessment. There's also been several articles come out, and there's been more information coming out as the CARES Act was passed, and a lot of cities have been able to receive allocations from some of the funds from that. For instance, the city of Houston, where they received a chunk of money from the CARES Act. I believe it was $404 million, and they were able to set aside at least $15 million for funding rent relief. And essentially what it is landlords can apply to participate in the program as long as they agree to not evict their tenants and set up payment plans for past due balances, amongst other requirements. And then once they've done that, they can direct their tenants to apply for assistance to cover any rent for the months, I believe, of April and May. And so there's different scenarios like that playing out across the United States. And it definitely is an unprecedented time when it comes to layoffs, and also when it comes to people being able to cover their rent and their mortgage. And yes, the overall consensus or trend in stories online has mostly been regarding tenants, and nobody's really talking about the landlords who, if their tenants don't pay, well, then the bank doesn't typically get paid the mortgage. And then if the bank takes back the property, then, like you said, both the tenant and the landlord are out of a house. So really doesn't do anybody any favors to only talk about it strictly from a tenant perspective. And so it'll be interesting to see how this continues to play out. But so far it looks like that scenario that is playing out in Houston, even though $15 million is not a significant amount of money when it comes to rentals in a city that large, it's still interesting to see how this will continue to play out, and hope for the best, but definitely plan for the worst. And like you said, retaining existing tenants is of the utmost importance. And so doing things like incentives to renew early, even keeping rent amounts the same, things like that. A lot of landlords are starting to utilize those types of tactics to try to keep their tenants in their rentals as opposed to having to compete for a new tenant with other rentals in the market that are also vacant for one reason or another, likely due to the scenario that we find ourselves in right now. As far as federal regulators go, some of them have allowed homeowners affected by this pandemic to have their mortgage payments possibly reduced or suspended for possibly up to 12 months, is what I've read in a couple places. Do you see this causing more of a problem? And how could landlords avoid this issue as well as be proactive about receiving rent payments from their tenant?
Yeah, it's important to understand that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the majority of their loans are multifamily. And so a lot of the smaller DIY landlords are not dealing with a Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae loan. And so even though they put out this announcement and everybody was like, wow, this is great, this is really helping, this is going to help landlords do a lot of things, most landlords who are managing their own properties or small property managers, it's not going to help at all because they don't have any of those loans. And so one, that's the first thing. And so most of the loans that go out to the smaller DIY landlords, about 10 years ago, they shifted kind of in the financial crisis. And about 40% of them are commercial banks. And so those are your Wells Fargo's, JP Morgan's, of the world. And then the other ones are through private lenders. And so if you think private lenders and commercial banks are going to be giving landlords a lot of leeway, probably not. Granted, all of them in 2008, they were all recipients of TARP, and so they all got a bailout that helped JP Morgan and Wells Fargo become our country's largest two banks, but with a lot of roll-ups of other banks as they went under. But now they don't seem to be as friendly towards landlords right now. So it's definitely important to understand that what you read out there is a lot of alleviation for landlords, but that isn't necessarily the case. There's actually not a lot of help for the smaller ones. It's the multifamily, larger REITs that seem to be getting some help. And so right now, again, to landlords, it's really important just to be focusing on how do we keep low vacancy rates, maintain high occupancy, really finding ways to work with tenants to bring rent in. And so avoiding, any unnecessary way to get rid of a tenant. Of course, if they can't pay, then it's not a tenant that can stay there. But finding ways, of maintaining rent and working with tenants to get that rent in is really important.
So to summarize that, basically, DIY landlords are not necessarily going to be receiving any type of assistance, at least not from the big news about the whole Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac thing. And the name of the game is, again, to really try to retain tenants and to incentivize tenants to renew early, to pay early, and so on and so forth. So that makes complete sense. Now, with some states having a grace period of up to 6 months with no late fees or evictions during the shelter-in-place order, what, in your opinion, are some ways that landlords can potentially avoid their tenants from taking advantage of that and falling way behind on rent and then just getting into a situation that really isn't good for anybody?
Yes, there are some states. Oregon is definitely one of them where I originated from, and so I've been watching that quite a bit, but watching all the states. And there are some quick actions to judgment there. One thing to really focus on when it comes to tenants is just like a landlord, if you've heard that banks are going to be lenient on allowing you to, delay some payments, it's going to accumulate over time. Tenants aren't any more foolish. And so one, working with them, because definitely you want to keep your occupancy rates high and vacancy rates low. And so working with them is important in finding out, each individual situation. I don't necessarily think it should be a company-wide policy, but you should already have ways if people are struggling that they can reach out to you and address it and, go from there. But one thing to think about is just in general in economics, incentives are very powerful. And so tenants know that this is going to come back. They know it'll be there. So thinking of, the stick and carrot, it's a great way to, really look at the carrot side of this, and that is, you know, thinking of ways to offer discounts maybe for receiving rent on time. And this is one of those genius incentive ways that as tenants are thinking through paying rent, like, if the average rent in the country is a little under $1,200 now, and if it's a $50 late fee if paid after the fourth, you might do the same thing where you say, actually, if I can get the rent in now, you will find it's much better than a tenant who is delaying and trying to see if they can take advantage of a situation and just see what happens. Definitely follow all your normal standard procedures that go out, but offering incentives, so offering carrot instead of throwing a stick out, could see your rents increase. So we've already started doing that effective on ours in April. And so it's been pretty successful. And so we'll kind of maintain that for ours. But yeah, just looking for creative ways to work with your tenants, to maintain that relationship.
That's great to hear that you've had some early on success with the whole carrot incentivizing tenants to be able to pay rent early and incentivizing that. Everybody's definitely in a situation that it's not really good for anybody, and so working with the tenants is definitely of utmost importance, like you said, to reduce vacancy and retain high occupancy rates, and using the whole stick and carrot approach. Definitely valuable information for landlords to be listening to. And I have heard many landlords mentioning that as well, that they've definitely taken the whole carrot approach, giving as much as 10% off of rent for early payments, and that they too have seen quite a bit of success with that. So it's great to hear that you personally have experienced that early on, and that you've seen some success with that. With people having to leave things like luxury rentals, though, due to the crisis, for instance, Airbnb is even reining back in their luxury rental side of the business. Do you see a potential shift in rent pricing for some of the higher rents in the United States?
This is a fun question. What's strange right now is, even in this market, so there were some interesting things already happening in our economy. As we went through data, we saw in Q1 for the first time of 2020, rents started to decline. They're only by 1%, so but you did see it. And so this sort of happened at a time when the shift in the rental market was happening. And so if everything had stayed normal, I think right now we'd be talking about, where are rents? They're flat or slowly declining. And so having that sort of already happening, and this is definitely a swing overall. However, in the middle of this, you're actually seeing the luxury rentals slightly increasing. I know that sounds strange. You're also seeing second home, kind of vacation type home rent increasing, which you would normally see those decreasing. And a lot of that is because families are, running from the city and looking for places, that are, more luxurious, that they can camp out for a month to 2 months, and so a little more room than their maybe normal apartment or something. And so yeah, we'll see what happens with luxury and how long this goes on. But the home away type VRBO homes right now seem to be increasing, but your average, working class neighborhood, these are the ones where you are seeing a small adjustment in rent. So it dropped already a little bit, and so you're starting to see it took a few more days to get a place rented, and so those changes already were happening in Q1. So in Q2, you're definitely going to see, that start to change even more. And so what happens is landlords who have vacancies are trying to compete now for tenants. As they compete for tenants, they're going to go into a pricing war, and that by definition is lower rent prices. And when you have lower rent prices, and then you have a street and there's 5 rentals on it, and one of them now rents for $200 less than yours, your tenant will hear about it, and then that word will spread, and then everybody, when one comes available for $200 less than your current rental, they'll apply for it. And that is when tenants take kind of power. You're having to now either grapple with lowering rent to a tenant or remarketing that if the tenant moves out at a lower price in order to win tenants. That's why the last thing you want to do is lose your tenant. It's really a game right now about winning tenants, making sure they stay in, keep the communication log open with them. Of course, they got to be paying. A good tenant is one who pays. Low maintenance requests and pays. And so that by definition is a good tenant. And this market is about keeping good tenants. So if you have one, really be open to new ideas about how to keep good tenants, and don't go through the cost of trying to, end up competing for a tenant on a vacant unit. You will save money overall by maintaining a good tenant in your rental.
Yeah, a paying tenant and a low maintenance tenant is definitely the best tenant to have, for sure. I 100% agree with that statement. And there's definitely been a increase, especially now in vacancy rates for vacation rentals, especially since travel has pretty much come to a screeching halt. And there have been articles and whatnot published about that. So I totally agree with the whole assessment of the rental industry. And what you noted is interesting is people trying to get to places outside of the city with more space and whatnot, which makes total sense with the whole quarantine thing in place and shelter in place. And even though a lot of those restrictions are being loosened up, I think a lot of people have been fundamentally affected by the cultural shift and awareness in people's perception of germs and how easily things are transmitted, and the whole social distancing thing. And I think that that's going to affect people for quite some time to come. And so it's actually a very interesting point that you make about the whole rentals further out of the city, like in the country and stuff. That's actually, I find that a very interesting point. And I'm curious to see how that plays out over the next 6, 8, 12 months, and maybe even beyond that. That's definitely a very interesting point that you made there. Given how connected the world actually is now, and things like this could actually happen more often in the future, potentially, what are some ways that you think DIY landlords can prepare for future unknowns, so that the next time they're required to stay inside for 1, 2, or even 3 months, they'll be more prepared?
Now that's a fun question. I definitely have an answer for that one. And that is really setting up your tenant-landlord relationship in its full capacity on TenantCloud. It really allows you to have video, pictures. You can request, a number of things from your tenant. I mean, you really have no need to even go to the rental. If anything, you can do a quick drive-by every once in a while from the outside. But I mean, pay rent, message, sign lease agreements, send notices back and forth, collecting rent, maintaining your full accounting, all of that, the full flow of a maintenance request, even down to having contractors, assigned and scheduled to go over there, can all be done digitally. And so really moving to that kind of, experience and utilizing TenantCloud for its full capacity. And it's to its full capacity and for all the features that are available to you. They were designed just for this, kind of a situation, to allow a tenant-landlord relationship to be something that doesn't have to be a face-to-face. It wasn't for this purpose necessarily in mind that we're now dealing with. It was more for the general landlord to be able to be remote from anywhere, any place. But it is in the same vein that you can utilize the benefits of technology now to really maintain a great relationship with the tenant and run your business. Another data point to put out there that's really interesting as we have gone through rent, and that is tenants have the ability to set up automatic payments for their rent. And if you compare rents that are paid via check, checks are 10% lower in being paid on time for April than those that were paid online. And then if you look at those online compared to those that were paid with automatic payments, there's a 2% deviation. So anyone who had automatic payments online had almost no interruption in collecting rent. Those who had payments available for the tenant to pay online but didn't have automatic payments were then the second highest to get rent paid. And anyone who's doing cash or check of any sort, there was long delays. I mean, I think tenants who pay with a check and cash are already, hopefully no one's accepting cash. That should be a major faux pas now. It's going to be extremely hard if you have to now go into the court systems to do an eviction through all this, and you have a history of collecting cash of any sort. It's going to be the least supported that a judge is going to look at because you took cash. There are few records. A tenant can kind of say whatever they want, and you're down with no real history other than your accounting software, which if you do, hopefully you've tracked it all in TenantCloud, because that will be your only saving grace if you've accepted cash. Checks are the next one you don't want tenants to have to mail you. They are now, it already takes 3 days for mail to come in, plus your check now is going to take 7 to 9 days for clearing in most most banks. So if you are the old check fashion, hopefully you've already found that that's out. But believe it or not, not too many years ago, 82% of rent was still cash, cashier's check, or a paper check. And so with that still out there, there's a lot of people who still collect rent in this fashion. And I think the jury's still out whether or not a paper check can carry any type of bacteria that lives for too long. So we're not so certain that collecting check on that is necessarily dangerous. But what we do know is by collecting a paper check, you're just giving an excuse for your tenant to delay it even longer. And so have it be immediate, set them up for automatic accounting inside TenantCloud. So if they're late, the late fee is triggered immediately the second they're late. And so you don't have to be the bully to do anything. Accounting software does it for you. Leave it on the tenant to have to ask for a waiver. Don't automatically give a waiver. And if you take paper checks, there's a big disputing time because technically you have to accept. So if it's from the time the letter was post-dated. And so you're not going to receive that for 3 days, and then you have to deposit it. So by allowing a paper check, you're really giving them almost 2 weeks of grace period before you can push a late fee on. So you've kind of created this whole variance that's hard to trigger when you should charge the late fee. And then if you do, there's going to be this big dispute. Or if it's digital, it's automatic. They didn't pay. They know they didn't pay, and boom, automatically the system came in. And so now the burden is on them to ask you to waive it, and you're going to find fewer of those. So naturally, you're going to have more people trying to pay on time. And so, yeah, definitely set up TenantCloud, get the full extensive suite of services that are available inside of there, so your tenants can be one, prepared on their side to pay you, and two, you can be set up to receive your rent to maintain your rental business. So, yeah.
That is one of the cool things that I get to see firsthand is landlords, their feedback about how they're able to now manage their rentals remotely with no hassle whatsoever. And the automatic payment feature is definitely a big hit with both tenants and landlords alike for obvious reasons. But tenants love it because they don't even have to think about it. In fact, some tenants say they just set it to pay and they're good to go, and they don't ever have to think about it. And they don't even necessarily need to log into their account unless they need to submit a maintenance request or talk to the landlord through TC Messenger or whatever. And then landlords love it because they get their payments on time, and they don't have to chase any tenants down for rent payments or send out reminders. It's really reduced a lot of the workload for both parties involved, which is good for everybody. And so it's one of the cool things is being able to see that firsthand, and that landlords really enjoy the ability to be able to work remotely wherever, especially at a time like this. And definitely agree with the whole check thing. Not quite certain myself. Haven't read too much about that, about the whole virus thing being able to stay on a document or paper or anything for any given period of time. But I mean, why risk it? Just you have the ability to accept payments online. And it's definitely convenient. And a lot of landlords have certainly been taking advantage of that. And tenants also, especially now that a lot of offices are closed or they've been forced to close by the state or city that the landlord and the tenant are in. Even people who have had physical locations, they no longer have a physical location. They're not even able to go there and open up the doors. And so people really haven't been able to have any of that interaction. You can't walk in and hand somebody a check anymore or anything like that. And so, definitely take advantage of checking out TenantCloud and the full suite of services like Joe was saying. And check out the automatic payment features and the automatic invoicing features and functionality, and all of the online banking functionality. There's no payment processing fees if you use the ACH payment processing service on TenantCloud through the integrated TC payments powered by Dwolla. And so definitely check that out. It is very cool to be able to use a tool like this at such a time as this. So I appreciate you taking the time, Joe, to sit down with us and help answer some of these questions that a lot of people have been asking, and providing some of your personal insight into how you see things proceeding from here, and your experiences so far as you have personally encountered some of these issues yourself with rentals you've managed. So definitely appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to sit down and go through some of this with us. And hopefully some of the people who are listening or watching this have found value from it. And remember that you can check out all of our media content, both podcasts through sites like Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, the whole 9 yards. You can also check us out on our TenantCloud YouTube channel. Just type in TenantCloud YouTube channel on Google and it'll come up as the first link on there, and check out our media content. We have full system webinars, demos, instructional videos, and then other media content on there, as well as other interviews, sit downs with Joe Edgar, the CEO of TenantCloud, and providing some of his insight into landlording and property management, and also, of course, TenantCloud. And so again, thanks for taking the time to sit down with us, Joe. I really appreciate it.